Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or you are allowing your politics to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have with us today Mr. Todd McFarland. He's the Associate General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership, a Washington-based organization dedicated to protecting freedom for Americans of all faiths. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown. Dr. Lawrence Brown is the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Walla Walla University. Gentlemen, it's great to have you here with us today. And why don't we just jump into our first segment? Our first segment is talking about some activities that's going on in the state of Arizona. The state legislature there is actually working on a bill in which they're moving forward, where they're trying to figure out how to deal with issues of explicitly sexual material and how they can bar that information from getting to children and things of that nature. But most of it is really calling in question whether or not it's an issue of free speech. I'm going to ask Tim Schultz if you would kind of help us to understand and kind of unpack a little bit what they're hoping to do. And let's talk about what this makes sense or whether it doesn't.
Yeah, Orland, I think that there are always these controversies about what is being taught in school. And I think that increasingly that has come under scrutiny because parents are looking into that more in the COVID era. You know, as school went on to Zoom, parents were seeing more and more what was being taught.
Right.
I think the problem is that these populist backlashes to what is often being taught in school frequently they go too far. They seek to micromanage the kinds of things are being taught in public schools. And then that also creates problems. So I think that the problem here is that these kinds of things never really get dealt with nuance. And sometimes the solutions, the cures are sort of worse than the disease.
You know, Dr. Golden, let me ask you this. We're starting to see parents wanting to get more involved, but I'm not sure if I'm really comfortable with certain parents helping to kind of shape curriculum for my children in school. I mean, how do we kind of find a proper balance with this?
Well, I think you find a proper balance by recognizing that this is sort of, as Tim alluded to, a populist right-wing ideology gone awry, right? Sort of micromanaging what's being taught in schools, raising questions of academic freedom for teachers in schools. And it raises, to me, the question of an inconsistency as it relates to free speech. In the Masterpiece Cake Shop case a few years ago, religious freedom advocates from the far right were all over free speech in terms of the cake shop owner's right to refuse speaking or making a cake that reflected values inconsistent with his religious beliefs. And I think if we're going to be consistent on free speech, we have to be consistent across the board and not selective and just censor speech that we don't like and promote speech that's consistent with things that we do like.
Well, I got to tell you, I think the last election showed that Arizona may be getting a little bit more purple than red, but Todd, right-wing gone crazy? Is that what we see going on here?
Well, you know, I do think that, you know, schools and school districts and parents do have an interest in making sure that material is age appropriate, right? And, you know, there have been materials that I think a lot of parents really raise questions on. These materials, you know, when we talk about sort of sexually explicit stuff, let's talk about what this is really about. It tends to be material that is talking about, you know, LGBT issues, is talking about sort of sexuality from maybe a non-traditional or what a lot of people wouldn't say isn't normal or standard or what they're used to. You know, and it's an iterative process. And I do think parents in a democratic process have a right to influence what's there. And if people don't like it, they have a constitutional right to send their kids to private school where there's not going to be these kind of restrictions. And so I do think there's an interest there. Now, whether or not every single book and so forth that is being banned is appropriate or not, you know, I think is another question. But somebody has to make this call, right? And generally speaking, you know, parents should have a say in that, given that someone's going to make a call. It is their kids, not the state's kids.
Well, I got to tell you, Dr. Brown, I mean, I know why the cage bird sings. It's like yanked off the list because of these type of activities. And you there in a city like New York, could you even imagine talking about the opportunity to ban some of this material, which would probably include LGBTQ activities and information from their perspective? I mean, what are your thoughts on how you would have to handle something like that in your particular state?
Well, it was with great interest the other day that I listened to a radio program where they were talking about some of the books that are quote unquote suspect. And one of my colleagues used the word awry, and you know something's wrong when people want to take issue with a book about Michelle Obama. And I said to myself, okay, this is turning into some kind of party here. I agree. Parents have a vested interest in making sure their kids get appropriate material. However, the person who's driving the bus, we need to double check his driver's license, because books about famous figures, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, I'm like, come on, really? That's what we're gonna have a problem with now?
Well, Tim Schultz, so how do we manage this? I mean, I understand I'm a parent, I have children, I'd like to be in control of some of that activity, but what happens now when I'm starting to be in a position where what somebody else's backyard thinks about what we should be dealing with, and I'm completely against them? I got to show up at school board meetings and fighting that fight on a regular basis, or is there a better way to handle this?
My own view on this is that there is a democratic process for parents to have a say in what their children learn, and that's school board elections. Those are things parents can participate in. And then I think that it's also now, I think, in our best interest to have curriculum be transparent. There have been a number of proposals in states for curriculum transparency laws that would put curriculum online where parents could see it. And then if parents want to object through the democratic process of school board elections, they're capable of doing that. I think transparency is good. I think parents do need to know what's being taught. They do have a right to object. I even think they have a right to opt out, or should have a right to opt out, as they have for many, many years on matters of sex education. I think parents have a right to be notified and to opt out of sensitive subjects if they want to have their kids stay home that day, or, take recess for an hour. But I think that sort of micromanaging these things from the state legislature probably doesn't tend to turn out very well.
Tim Golden, I'm going to give you the last word on this, but I saw a governor's election here in Virginia, not too far from where I was, and that election probably turned on the issue of him talking about parents being able to engage in curriculum activities as it relates to their children. And so this is actually turning into a very political issue, and as we continue to fight that fight, what should it look like going forward?
I think going forward, if we're going to have a fight, it has to be guided by parents participating in the democratic process and not politicians trying to get votes. The governor of Virginia made his biggest political score on the issue of critical race theory in schools. And I can tell you right now that most of the people talking about critical race theory have no idea what it is. Fact of the matter is, it isn't even taught in elementary schools. It's taught primarily in law schools. And if anybody's interested, I've taught it out here at Walla Walla University. So the reality is that if going forward, the battle has to be guided by parents and not by politicians.
Well, thanks, gentlemen, and I appreciate that topic. But why don't we move on to segment number 2? Segment number 2 is talking about the Shields of Strength case. Now, I find this to be very interesting dialogue because we have the military here and we have an organization that's been responsible for putting in place these dog tags. It has this strength activities on there talking about courage. We found out that military individuals have loved having this for a while. But now there is an entity that's coming up that's saying they have a problem with this simply because there is a religious connotation. I'm going to start with you, Todd. Has this gone too far, or is it safe to say maybe this is trying to get our military groups to be a little bit too connected from a religious standpoint, and in the long run that may end up harming us in the path of not going down that road? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the connection between faith, God, and the military is a very, very long-standing one. And, I don't think a lot of people fully understand how deeply entwined faith is in the military. I mean, you've got situations here dealing with life and death in extreme circumstances, and those are times in which people turn to God and turn to faith. The U.S. military employs more pastors and religious personnel in the form of chaplains than most and a lot of churches, right? They've got a lot of people, and there's good reasons for that.
Right.
In this particular case, where this is something that the soldiers are doing themselves, they request particularly. I mean, I think the question comes down is to seeing this inscribed on a dog tag. Is this viewed as the government endorsing this, or this individual member of faith? And I think it is a stretch to say that, given the context here, that this is somehow the government endorsing religion, right? The service member has to request this. They choose it. It's not compulsory in any sense. And it's also not something that's generally viewed to the public, right? This isn't where you're going to be driving by City Hall and see a Ten Commandments monument out there. Whether that should be constitutional or not, we can debate. But this is something that's very private, very personal, and it doesn't seem to really implicate a lot of the concerns that we would normally have with this type of religious speech on a government, something connected to the government.
Well, Dr. Brown, let me ask you this, though. The military has always been a group that it's been, about the chain of command, staying focused, following orders. Some may say that this religious connection may start causing individuals to start thinking more about their God as opposed to thinking about their orders that they've gotten. Do you see a conflict there, or do you see an issue we need to be concerned with? What happens if all of a sudden I'm not following orders because my God told me to do something else?
Well, trust me, if it ever gets to that point, I think they will know how to handle it. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to chalk this one right up with the folks who get bent out of shape over the dollar bill saying, "In God we trust." It's a nothing burger. And at the end of the day, as Todd pointed out, the history goes so far back here until it's really absurd to try and turn this into something that it's not. And, one of those little blips on the radar that if you ignore it, I tend to think it goes away.
Well, Tim Schultz, let me ask you this. If you have religious organizations that are supporting this, and you have non-religious organizations that are saying we should do away with it simply because it should have no place in the military, is that really being unreasonable?
I think that this particular controversy arises from complaints by the so-called Military Religious Freedom Foundation. They actually are a freedom from religion organization, a very trollish organization that just opposes just about any exercise of religion in the military, including chaplains, often including the gravestones at Arlington National Cemetery. So I actually agree with Pastor Brown, Dr. Brown. I think that this is a nothing burger, and this is a left-wing trollish organization raising money on something that really is a non-issue.
So, Dr. Golden, left-wing trolling organization. I think we see left-wing trolling organizations on a regular basis nowadays. Do we just simply stiff-arm this group and say, listen, what you're saying doesn't make any sense? Or should we be thinking about from the standpoint that what's the downside of just keeping this straight down the road? No military dog tags. When you die, we understand that you've given your service for your country, but is it really necessary to have a religious connection in there in any way?
Well, I think this group is worthy of the Heisman, the old stiff arm. This may be a rare moment on this show, but I think this verdict is unanimous. I see this, as Dr. Brown pointed out so nicely, a nothing burger. Thank you for making me hungry early in the morning out here. But I think this is a situation. Look, this is a practice that's been longstanding. It's been going on for a long time. And there's no parade of horribles that has come from it. As Todd pointed out, people are sort of free to get one if they want one. It's a very personal matter. It's not a government endorsed message. It's an individual message that people choose to adopt and put it on a dog tag. So yeah, this is much ado about nothing. And again, this left-wing trolling group is worthy of the Heisman, for sure.
Well, let me ask you this, Todd. I had somebody say to me, well, maybe we should allow all of these individuals to get pictures of their loved ones put on their dog tags because those individuals are important to them. If we went down that road, have we gone too far? Or is it simply something, let's do whatever our men in service and women in service actually need?
Well, I think whether or not they're going to go with pictures or other approach and so forth. That's something for the military to work out, right? This is, these dog tags have a functional purpose. They found a way to do this in a way that, that doesn't interfere with that purpose. And just because you allow one thing doesn't mean you have to allow everything, right? And so, again, I think this is a much ado about nothing, as the other panelists have said. And if they want to look at other, messages or so forth, that is a comfort to service members, then they can do that during the normal course. But there needs to be a demand for that, and not just some hypothetical thought up by, people who've never served in the military.
Well, I think the point that you really raise about letting the military make the call, the men and women who are in leadership role there, who understand probably more precisely what the needs are for those on the battlefield than anybody like me or some other person who has not served. But I think we also want to make sure that we're keeping an eye out to make sure that we are finding the appropriate ways in which we are seeing any type of religious connotation in the military, so we don't end up seeing any violations against one's religious beliefs. Well, great. Well, why don't we go on to our next segment? Our next segment is talking about a specific case, and it's a case that's called the FBI versus Fazaga. This I found to be very interesting in that it was a case in which the FBI apparently had connected with some Muslims to try to see if they could get them to actually spy against Muslim religious communities. And it turns out that these individuals decided, no, we're not going to go down that road, and then they found themselves in trouble. Dr. Golden, I got to throw this out to you. Is this basically the government basically strong-arming somebody, trying to take advantage of them, hopefully to get an inside track on something that they didn't have the ability to get an inside track on through some other form or fashion?
Well, in a sense, I think that's true. I think government agents, particularly law enforcement, use a variety of tactics that are I think, if brought to light, like this case brings to light, are problematic. The real question for me is, in the event, if this case is allowed to go down the road of sort of affirming the FBI's practice of withholding certain types of evidence against people, what happens in the event of a criminal prosecution? And I'm concerned, having a background as a criminal defense lawyer, of what the government's obligations may be under Brady versus Maryland if some of that evidence happens to be exculpatory. So you may end up having competing interests in that you have a law enforcement interest in trying to keep a certain operation covert, but then you have an interest of a criminal defendant, which is very significant, that needs to know if there's anything that the government has in its possession from an evidentiary standpoint that tends to exonerate them or exculpate them. So this will be an interesting case going forward. But in the end, law enforcement use all sorts of tactics that many of us would find objectionable, but tend to survive constitutional muster. We'll see if this one falls in line with that traditional sort of track.
Tim Schultz, I got to ask you, asking somebody to spy on their faith community, that's almost as bad as asking somebody to spy on their spouse. This just seems like this has just gotten way too close. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that it depends on the circumstances. If you're talking about efforts to stop terrorism that sort of emanates from, in this case, from Islamic terrorists, you're naturally going to be working with other Muslims who usually are the ones who provide the government information that stops these terrorist attacks. So it's not unusual at all to be working with other Muslims. I think the question is exactly how are you doing that, right? And I think that so a lot of this comes down to details. And I think whether that's wrongful behavior or whether that's smart law enforcement behavior really kind of comes down to a fact-specific inquiry that courts are going to have to determine.
And Todd, I think the issue that we have to give law enforcement the tools to do their job, because obviously all of us want to live in a safe community, but I can't even imagine that someone would contact some members of the Baptist church to tell them, could you go in and do some type of spying on those in your congregation? It almost feels like there was something about Islam and Muslim that took place here. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think a couple things. First of all, let's talk about what this actually is, which is the state secrets privilege, right? Which is this very powerful tool the government has that was developed by a Supreme Court case that was really based upon some false information. It was they brought a lawsuit. The government said, "Oh, we can't devolve this information. It'll implicate national security." And then 50 years later, when we do get the information, it turns out it didn't. I don't think it's accurate to say that the government wouldn't look in other faiths, right? There have been other organizations, and even ones connected to religion and faith, where the government has infiltrated. You think during the civil rights era, the FBI was all over a lot of the people that were opposing civil rights groups and so on, and interviewing them and talking to them. And a lot of those people were, connected to more traditional faith groups. And so it becomes very difficult, though, when, the sad reality is that Islam has been used and perverted by some to commit terrorism in a way that we don't see in the United States with some other more traditional faith groups. I think the other side of this, too, is, my faith tradition, the Adventist Church, has had a lot of history in, especially during the Cold War, in places, without a lot of freedom, and they would send government monitors into church. I mean, this was the East Bloc, and many of those individuals end up converting to Adventism, especially afterwards. And so, again, no one wants the FBI sort of snooping around in their faith community and sort of spying on them. But also, I think faith communities, your job should be to sort of to share and to give a message. And, to some extent, you got to ask, well, what's going on in this faith community if the FBI shouldn't hear about it?
Well, I'm thinking that's an interesting question. What's going on in the faith community? I actually attended church in Washington, D.C., where I used to live on the same street with Leon Panetta when he was actually in charge of all of that activity. And we used to see strange people just sitting in the congregation with us. And we used to say we are probably the safest church in the nation. The question that I'm wondering is what's going on not only in these faith communities, but what's going on with the FBI and some of these big brother organizations that think that maybe they can just slide in the name of quote unquote, national protection, looking out for the big picture. But I don't know if I like the idea of that being in the same pews with me. Dr. Brown, what do you think about that?
Well, process matters. And when you start to abuse process, when you start to ignore good process, there's a whole parade of horribles that comes in its train. And people over the last few years, unfortunately, got into a big back and forth about I like Donald Trump, I don't like Donald Trump. I don't think that's the conversation people should have been having. You should have been asking, is the process doing what it's supposed to do, or is it being abused, or is it being broken? And I'm sorry. True story. Good friend of mine, he's converted. He's a retired pastor. He met the Lord. Amen. Before he met Jesus, he, as a person of color, used to go into the store with a white friend of his. He would look as suspicious as he could so that every eye in the store was trained on him. And while he was walking around looking as suspicious as he could, his white friend, who they didn't realize in the store was his friend, was robbing the place blind. All I'm saying is that to put this unfair microscope on the Muslim community while ignoring what's happening in some of our fundamentalist communities where people are taking license to do whatever they want to do because they feel that, quote unquote, this is how God would have it. I suspect that our willingness to ignore process in some places is going to come back and bite us very hard.
I'm going to give you the last word on that, Dr. Brown, but a very interesting dialogue that we've been talking about and something we probably need to keep our eye on going forward. Well, let's just get down to our final segment and appreciate all that you guys have been giving us. So first and foremost, Todd, tell me something I don't know.
One of the, I think, emerging areas in religious liberty concerns is going to be high school athletics. We've seen a number of lawsuits around the country in that area and accommodating people of faith. I think we could be seeing some more in the near future.
Wow, thank you on that. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
We've talked about the FBI today. There's no dispute that J. Edgar Hoover violated the Constitution left and right, was the worst law enforcement official of the 20th century. The FBI building is named after him. It shouldn't be.
Dr. Brown, tell me something I don't know.
At the rate we're going, I suspect that the pandemic is going to be one of the lesser things that we end up worrying about in the long run at the rate we're going.
Dr. Golden, tell me something I don't know.
The Voting Rights Act will continue to remain in deep peril even as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act bill proposed by Senator Leahy continues to go nowhere in the U.S. Senate.
Wow. That's a tough way to end, but gentlemen, appreciate you being here with us today, and thank you so much for being with us on Faith and Politics. I do want to thank our audience for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation, but just remember, if it's about God and government, it's about faith and politics. See you next time.